This isn't your house anymore, old man. Sit at the kids' table or go home. That's what my son said to me on Thanksgiving, standing in the kitchen I'd remodeled with my own two hands 40 years ago. He didn't whisper it. He said it loud enough for his wife and her parents to hear, and not one person at that counter looked up from their wine. What he forgot in that moment was that the deed to the house under his feet still had my name on it. At least, that's what I believed at the time. I'm grateful you're spending this time with me. Before I get into it, do me a favor and drop a comment telling me where you're listening from, your town, your state. I love seeing how far these stories reach. And just so you know, some details here have been changed for privacy and to make the lesson land. The heart of it is real enough. Let me back up. I had spent that whole morning in the kitchen. I'd been up since 5, the way I always was when my late wife was alive, because she liked the turkey, and by 6 so the house would smell like Thanksgiving when everyone woke up. She'd been gone 3 years by then, and I'd kept the tradition going mostly because stopping felt like letting another piece of her slip away. So there I was, basting a 22-pound bird, my reading glasses fogging up every time I opened the oven, humming something she used to hum, feeling almost okay for the first time in a long while. I'd let my son and his wife move in 2 years earlier. They'd come to me after he lost his job at the dealership, said they just needed a place to land while they got back on their feet. I had a 4-bedroom house and one old man rattling around in it. Of course I said yes. That's what you do for your kid. I paid the property taxes. I paid the heating bill, the water, the cable they insisted on upgrading. I bought the groceries because, as my daughter-in-law liked to remind me, the kids need to eat healthy, and that costs money. My grandson, Theo, was 9 years old, and honestly, he was the only reason I didn't lose my mind some days. Bright kid. Loved baseball. Called me Pop. I came around the corner from the kitchen carrying the relish tray, and that's when I heard it. The dining room was full. Not with my family, with hers. My daughter-in-law's mother and father, her sister, the sister's husband, 2 cousins I'd met maybe once. They were already seated at my table. The long oak one I bought after I made foreman, with the good china out and a bottle of scotch open that I'd been saving since my retirement party. My son stood at the head of the table. My seat. The host's seat. He had a carving knife in his hand like he was the one who'd raised that turkey from a chick. I set the relish tray down on the sideboard. I looked at him, and he looked back at me like I was a contractor who'd shown up on the wrong day. "There's no room for you here, Dad," he said. "This is for family. You can eat in the kitchen." I waited. "I want you to understand that." I didn't yell. I didn't throw anything. I just waited, and I looked at the people around that table. My daughter-in-law's father with his napkin already tucked into his collar, her mother pretending to study the centerpiece, and I looked for my son to laugh, to say he was kidding, to pull out a chair. He didn't. He turned and started carving the turkey I'd cooked. 41 years, I'd worked as a structural engineer. You learn something in that line of work. When a building starts to fail, you don't panic and you don't scream at the concrete. You go quiet. You find the load-bearing point. You figure out exactly where the weight is sitting and exactly what will happen if it moves. So I went quiet. I took off my apron, folded it once, and laid it over the back of the chair I was no longer welcome to sit in. Then I walked out of the dining room. The hallway in that house is lined with pictures. My wedding day. My boy's first Little League team. I coached it. His high school graduation. I passed every one of them on my way to the garage, and with each step I felt something I'd been holding on to for years just quietly let go of my hand. At the end of the hall, by the door to the garage, is the electrical panel. I opened it. I've known that panel like the back of my hand since I wired half of it myself, and I reached up and I pulled the main breaker. The whole house went dark. The hum of the refrigerator died. Somebody screamed, her mother I think, and I heard a glass tip over and a chair scrape. My son started shouting my name into the dark, banging into furniture. I didn't stay for it. I grabbed my coat off the hook, stepped out the front door into the cold November evening, and pulled it shut behind me. The lock clicked, and standing there on my own porch, breathing out a long white cloud into the dark, I felt lighter than I had in years. I drove. I didn't know where, I just drove, past all the houses with their warm orange windows and their families inside, until I found a diner out on the county road that still had its lights on. A waitress who looked as tired as I felt poured me a coffee without asking, and I wrapped my hands around the mug just to feel something warm. I figured I'd get a hotel for the night. Let them stew. Come back in the morning and have it out like adults. So I pulled out my phone to check my bank balance and book a room. I opened the banking app. I scrolled past my checking, down to the account I almost never touched. My wife's life insurance. $312,000. Every penny of it set aside, because I'd promised her at the hospital, actually promised her holding her hand that I'd never spend it on myself. That money was for Theo. His college, his future, the leg up neither of us ever got. I'd put it in writing in my will and everything. The balance read $4.11. I thought it was a glitch. I closed the app and opened it again. Same thing. $4. I pulled the phone right up to my face. My hands had gone cold and I couldn't feel the coffee mug anymore. I tapped into the transaction history and there was one line. A wire transfer. 2 days before Thanksgiving. The entire balance gone. Sent to an escrow company 2 counties over. And that's when the dinner made sense. The whole thing. My son blocking me from the table, humiliating me in front of strangers, making me the crazy old man in front of an audience. It wasn't drunk cruelty. It was a distraction. He picked a holiday when the banks are closed and lawyers are with their families. And he picked a fight ugly enough that he figured I'd be too heartbroken to look at my phone for a week. He hadn't just insulted me. He'd robbed me. He'd taken the last thing his mother ever left behind, and he'd taken it from his own son. I sat in that booth and something turned over inside me. The cold I'd felt walking out of the house turned into something else. I'd raised that boy. I taught him to throw a curveball and balance a checkbook and shake a man's hand, look him in the eye. And he'd looked me in the eye and stolen my dead wife's money. I drove to a motel that night, but I didn't sleep. I sat on the edge of the bed and I started doing what I do best. I started analyzing the structure, finding the load-bearing point, figuring out exactly what would happen when it moved. At 6 the next morning, I was sitting in my truck outside the law office of a man I'd known for 30 years. We built a youth center together back in the 80s, me drawing the plans, him handling the contracts. He buried his wife the same year I buried mine. He was, fortunately for me, one of the meanest real estate attorneys in the state, and he opened his office on the Friday after Thanksgiving because of the voicemail I left him at 4 in the morning. I didn't cry to him. I didn't talk about my feelings or my son or how it felt to be told there was no room for me at my own table. I laid it out the way I'd lay out a failed inspection. The wire transfer. The amount. The date. The escrow company. He listened without saying a word, and I watched the old friend in his face get put away somewhere and the attorney come out. When I finished, he sat back and told me plainly that banks don't move $300,000 on a phone call. There had to be paper. Something giving my son legal authority over my accounts. He pulled his chair to his computer and logged into the county recorder's database and typed in my name. It came up highlighted at the top. Filed 11 days earlier, a durable power of attorney, naming my son as my agent over my entire estate, my accounts, my property, my medical decisions. My friend read me the clauses out loud, his voice going flatter with each one. And then he scrolled to the signature page. There was my signature. Perfect. Every loop and slant of it exactly the way I sign. He practiced it the way you practice anything you're determined to get right. But under it was a notary stamp. My friend leaned in close, read the name, and I watched his jaw set. He knew that notary, a man who lost his license once already for stamping things he shouldn't, working out of the back of a tax prepet shop on the bad side of town. My son hadn't just forged my name. He paid a crooked notary to make it look real to a bank. This wasn't a moment of weakness. This was planned. For weeks he'd sat across the breakfast table from me, asking how I slept, while he practiced my handwriting upstairs. My friend wasn't done. He told me the missing money was likely just the deposit on something bigger. He pulled the escrow company's records and cross-referenced my son's name against pending real estate deals, and the screen filled up with a listing. A lake house, brand new construction, 40 minutes north on the water, boat dock, 3-car garage, the whole thing, listed at $1.1 million. My son drove a leased SUV and complained when I asked him to chip in for the water bill. And then my friend opened the property records for my own house. My house. The one I built. And a red banner stretched across the top of the file. Sale pending. $800,000. Cash. Buyer was a developer that buys up older homes, tears them down, and puts up two skinny new ones on the lot. The seller of record, using that forged power of attorney to do it without my knowledge, was my son. He'd sold the house out from under me, the living room where I taught Theo to walk, the backyard where I taught him to field a grounder, the kitchen that still smelled like his grandmother's cooking. Sold to be bulldozed. The $300,000 was the deposit on the lake house. The $800,000 from selling my house would cover the rest. He was using my house to buy his. My friend scrolled to the closing date. The sale of my home would finalize the following Friday. It was Friday now. I had exactly 7 days. He'd timed all of it around the holiday, betting on banks being slow and people being distracted and an old man being too gutted to fight. He made one mistake. He assumed I was already finished. I looked at my friend across that desk and I told him I didn't want to just stop the sale. I'd thought about it all night. If we marched into the police station right then, my son would lawyer up, claim it was a family misunderstanding, say I'd signed the papers months ago and forgotten because I'm old. And the worst part, my daughter-in-law, maybe even my son, would stand up and swear I was losing my mind. He'd get probation, he'd stay in my house, and he'd just wait for the next opening. I didn't want him to get a slap on the wrist. I wanted him to walk all the way into the trap and pull it shut himself. The second he wired $800,000 across state lines using a forged document, it stopped being a county forgery case and became federal wire fraud. Mandatory time. The kind you don't plea your way out of. My friend looked at me for a long moment, and I watched something like respect settle over his face. Then he turned back to his keyboard. What we did was quiet. He drafted a revocation of the power of attorney, a document that killed my son's authority completely, stated plainly and under penalty of perjury that I was in full possession of my mind and rendered that forged paper worthless. The beautiful part, the part my friend explained while he typed, was that it didn't require my son to be notified for it to take effect. We filed it directly into the state registry through the attorney's portal. A confirmation number came back in under a minute. The safety net under my son was gone, and he had no idea he was standing on nothing. Then I drove home. And this was the hard part. I had to walk back into that house and play the broken old man. I parked in the driveway. The power was back on, he'd found the breaker. I let my shoulders sag, let my feet drag, and I went inside. He was waiting for me in the hallway, arms crossed, doing his best to look 6 inches taller than he is. He told me my little stunt with the lights had embarrassed him in front of his in-laws, who'd had to leave early. He told me my memory was clearly going, that my behavior was getting dangerous, and that if I ever pulled something like that again, he'd make one phone call and have me declared incompetent. He'd already, he said, looked into a state facility 2 towns over. The cheap kind. He described it to me, the locked doors, the way they leave people in chairs all day, and he smiled while he did it. He wanted me to break, to scream, to cry, to give him a scene he could point to later. I gave him a small, tired nod and said I understood, and over his shoulder, through the open door to the garage, I saw the boxes. Stacked against the wall, taped shut, my handwriting on the side of one of them. My wife's china. He'd already started packing me out of my own life. Then my daughter-in-law came down the stairs. Her eyes were red. She took my arm in the kitchen, looked over her shoulder to make sure he wasn't listening, and begged me. She said to just go along with it, just for a few days, that he was closing a huge deal that was going to fix everything, that their marriage had been falling apart under the stress, and this was going to save it. She wasn't innocent. She didn't know about the forged signature, maybe, but she knew he was using my money to buy them a new life, and she decided my house and my dignity were a fair price to keep her marriage intact. That was the last thread. I pulled my arm out of her hand gently and went up to my room, but I had one more thing to find out. 2 days earlier, I'd taken cash out of an old account my son didn't know about and hired a private investigator, a retired sheriff's deputy, who now made his living photographing wealthy men's secrets. I met him that night in an empty parking garage downtown. He handed me an envelope and told me to brace myself before I opened it. I expected pictures of my son at the lake house with a realtor. Maybe measuring rooms. What I got were pictures of my son with a woman. Young, maybe 25, blonde, on his arm in the lobby of a luxury building. Pictures of them at dinner. Pictures of him signing for furniture being delivered to that lake house. Furniture for two. The investigator told me her name, told me she worked at the temp agency that had placed him in his last job, told me they'd been together 8 months. He'd registered 2 key fobs for the lake house gate. One for him, one for her. There was no bedroom for a 9-year-old in any of those plans. My son wasn't moving his family up in the world. He was going to steal everything. Let the bulldozers take my house, leave me on the street, and leave his own wife and his own son with nothing while he disappeared to a lake house with a girl half his age. My daughter-in-law had stood in my kitchen begging me to sacrifice myself to save a marriage that was already a stage set he was about to walk off of. I held those photographs and I knew I couldn't show them yet. If I did, he'd panic, cancel the sale, hide the deposit, and walk. I had to hold the worst card I'd ever held and wait for the exact right moment to lay it down. So I waited. For 6 more days, I played the defeated old man. I let him talk down to me. I packed a sad little suitcase with the bedroom door open so he could see his victory. The Thursday before closing, I watched from the top of the stairs as he gave the developers a final walkthrough, smiling while a man in a suit talked about which walls to knock down first and whether the oak in the front yard was worth saving. My son nodded along like a man eager to be told his childhood was worthless. Closing was set for 9 in the morning on Friday. The developer would wire $800,000 into the escrow account, and my son would route it to the lake house deal to close his own purchase. That Friday morning, he came down in a new suit he bought on credit. Navy, silk tie, shoes that clicked on the floor. He told me to have my boxes by the front door by the time he got home, that the transport van was coming the next day, that I was to sit quietly on the porch and not make a scene. Then my daughter-in-law came down in her robe, threw her arms around his neck, told him how handsome he looked and how proud she was of him for saving their family. He kissed her forehead and told her he loved her, and the lie came out of him so smoothly it turned my stomach. He walked out the door to go become a rich man. I was already moving. My truck was parked 2 streets over so he wouldn't see it leave. In my briefcase, I had the revocation and the envelope of photographs. I met my friend on the steps of the main bank downtown. We didn't speak. We went straight up to the branch manager, a sharp woman who knew my friend from a dozen old cases, and he laid it out. Active elder financial exploitation. Federal wire fraud in progress. He demanded an immediate full freeze on every account tied to my social security number. She asked me if I understood what a total freeze meant. That I'd lose access to my own money too, that anything pending would bounce. I told her to lock every door and weld it shut. I didn't care if I couldn't buy a cup of coffee for a month. She froze it. Then I opened my briefcase and handed her the revocation with the state confirmation number and my friend's notary seal. She read it, and the color left her face when she understood what was happening in real time, somewhere across town, in a closing room. She picked up the phone and called the bank's fraud division, read them the account, the routing number, the confirmation code. She flagged my son's escrow account as the receiver of a fraudulent transfer in progress. Then, we watched her screen. The escrow account showed 0. We waited. The clock on her wall ticked past 9. And right around 9:15, about the time my son was sitting in a glass conference room signing his forged name on a deed and shaking hands with men who wanted to bulldoze my house, a line of green text hit the screen. Incoming wire, $800,000. It never landed. The instant it tried to clear the final security check, it slammed into the freeze we put up 40 minutes before. The green turned red. A box covered the screen. Transaction denied. Account suspended. The $800,000 was caught, frozen, flagged, and gone into a federal holding queue. The manager confirmed it because the transfer crossed state lines, involved a forged document and a stolen identity, and cleared the federal dollar threshold. The system had already kicked an alert to the FBI. Agents were getting the packet, the location of the signing, the name on the account. My son wasn't a man bullying his father in a dark hallway anymore. He was a federal suspect, and he'd done the crime himself, in writing, on camera, with his own hand. There was no taking it back. I pictured him walking out of that office into the cold, feeling like a king, reaching for his keys, and his phone ringing. The realtor on the line screaming that the deposit check bounced, that it was flagged for fraud, that the lake house was back on the market, and there were 2 men in suits in the lobby asking where he was. There was only one place left for him to run. Home. I beat him there. My friend came with me, and 2 more cars pulled into the driveway right behind us. Federal agents, the ones working the case. I sent word to a neighbor to keep Theo at her place for the afternoon. My daughter-in-law had run out to grab the boy's forgotten jacket. The house was empty and quiet, and I sat down in my own leather chair, the one my son had called ugly and planned to throw out, and the agents took their places in the shadows by the archway, and we waited. He came up the driveway too fast and half fell out of the SUV. His coat was open, his tie loose, his face a shade of red I'd never seen. He kicked the front door instead of using his key, kicked it again, and stormed in screaming my name, saying I'd done something to the accounts and I'd better fix it. He came around the corner into the living room, ready to tower over the broken old man. And he stopped dead. I was sitting calm in my chair. My friend stood beside me with that cold lawyer's smile, and then my son's eyes found the 2 men stepping out of the shadows with federal badges on their belts, and I watched everything drain out of him at once. He tried to smile. He tried to call it a misunderstanding. He looked at me and said, "Dad, tell them it's a family thing, tell them everything's fine." Calling me dad now. The agent who'd been quiet the whole time stepped forward and told him they were investigating federal wire fraud, forgery, and elder financial exploitation, and that he should choose his next words carefully. That's when my daughter-in-law walked in the back door with Theo's jacket in her hand, humming, and froze in the doorway. She saw the badges. She saw her husband against the wall, and the man she'd begged me to sacrifice everything for didn't reach for her, didn't shield her. He pointed at her and screamed that it was all her idea, that she'd planned it, that she'd made him do it. He threw the mother of his child to the wolves to save himself right there on the hardwood floor. She dropped the jacket, and I knew it was time to lay down the last card. I stood up, opened my briefcase, and set the envelope of photographs on the coffee table in front of her. I fanned them out. My son with the blonde woman. The dinner. The furniture for 2. The lake house with 2 key fobs and no room for a little boy. I told her, as gently as I could manage, that he was never building a future for her and Theo, that he'd registered that house for himself and a 25-year-old, and that he was going to let the bulldozers take this one and leave the 2 of them in the snow. She didn't scream. She just sank down onto the floor and made a sound I hope I never hear again. The sound of a person watching their whole life turn out to be a stage set. The agents pulled my son off the wall and put the cuffs on him. And I'll tell you the honest truth, that click was the most peaceful sound I'd heard in 3 years. They read him his rights and walked him out the front door he'd kicked in, while he twisted around screaming for me to call the bank, screaming for his wife to look at him. She didn't look up. I closed the door and locked it. My daughter-in-law was still on the floor. After a while, she looked up at me with a ruined face and started to apologize, said she never knew how far it went, begged me to let her and Theo stay, swore it would all be different now. And I want to be honest with you, because this is the part I still sit with. A piece of me wanted to pick her up off that floor. She was the mother of my grandson. But I remembered her hand on my arm in the kitchen, begging me to give up my home and my dignity to save her marriage. And I knew her tears weren't for what they'd done to me. They were for the life that had just evaporated. I told her she had until the end of the month to find a place. I told her, and I meant it, that this was no longer her home. She cried harder, and it took everything I had not to fold. But I'd folded my whole life. Folding is how I ended up told there was no room for me at my own table. I didn't leave it there, though. And this is the part that matters most to me. I told her that Theo would never want for anything. My wife's money, what was recovered of it, went into an irrevocable trust in his name, managed by an independent trustee, locked down so that neither his mother nor his father nor anyone else could ever touch it. It's there for his college, for his first home, for a start in life. And I told her that I intended to stay in that boy's life, every single day she'd allow it, and that I'd go to court for the right to, if I had to. Because none of this, not 1 minute of it, was ever about getting even with a 9-year-old. My son is in a federal facility now, awaiting sentencing, and his own lawyer has told him to expect years, not months. My daughter-in-law moved into an apartment across town. It surprised me, but she still brings Theo by on Sundays. We don't say much to each other, but she said something the last time that stuck with me. She said her own father had run off when she was a girl, and she'd spent her whole life so afraid of a man leaving that she let one rob her blind to keep him. I didn't have an answer for that. I just told her Theo could stay for dinner. This past Sunday, the boy and I sat at that long oak table, the two of us, eating spaghetti off the good china because I've decided the good china is for whoever I love, holiday or not. He asked me if his dad was coming back. I told him the truth as soft as I could, that his dad did some things that have consequences, but that none of it was Theo's fault, and that I wasn't going anywhere. He nodded the way kids do when they're filing something away to understand later, and then he asked me to throw the ball with him in the yard before it got dark. So we did. I want to leave you with the thing it took me 41 years and one stolen Thanksgiving to learn. I always thought keeping the peace meant keeping quiet. I thought if I just absorbed enough, paid for enough, forgave enough, I could hold my family together. But silence isn't peace. Silence is just the sound a man makes while he's being taken apart. Blood doesn't make someone family. Respect does. Loyalty does. And love without a backbone isn't love. It's just a door propped open for whoever wants to walk through and take what's yours. If you're an older parent listening to this, and someone in your family keeps asking you to give up a little more of yourself for the sake of peace, I want you to hear me. Protect your independence. Keep your name on your own accounts. Ask the hard questions early, while you still can. And don't let anyone make you feel like loving your family means letting them strip you bare. I almost learned it too late. I'm sitting at the head of my own table again. The house is quiet, but it's a good quiet now. And every Sunday there's a 9-year-old across from me asking for seconds, and that's the only family I needed all along. Tell me where you're listening from, and tell me honestly, what would you have done in my place? Your stories are the reason I keep telling mine. If this one meant something to you, stay with me for the next one. For 3 years after my wife passed, I kept telling myself that a quiet house was a peaceful house. I confused silence with peace, and that one mistake nearly cost me everything I'd built. When my son stood at the head of my table and told me there was no room for me, the truth is he wasn't lying about something new. He was just saying out loud what I'd allow to become true a little more each year. Every time I paid a bill I shouldn't have, every time I swallowed a comment that should have ended a conversation. A man teaches people how to treat him. I'd spent years teaching my own son that my dignity was negotiable. And one Thanksgiving he simply collected on the lesson. What saved me wasn't anger, and it wasn't luck. When I found that account drained down to $4, every part of me wanted to drive back to that house and scream until my throat gave out. If I had, my son would have walked. He'd have hidden the money, hired a lawyer, and called me a confused old man. And a judge might have believed him. Instead, I went quiet, the way I learned to go quiet on a job site when a structure starts to fail, because panic doesn't find the weak point, a clear head does. I let him think he'd won so the trap could close on his own hand. The difference between a man who gets robbed and a man who gets justice often comes down to whether he can keep his head when his heart is breaking. But cleverness alone wouldn't have carried me, and neither would patience. There were 6 nights I lay awake in that house playing the broken father while I knew exactly what he'd done, and the only thing that got me through was refusing to quit. Marvin opened his office the morning after Thanksgiving. Delia begged me to surrender. My son threatened me with a locked facility. Any one of those could have been a reason to fold. And folding is what I'd always done. This time I didn't. If you take anything from what happened to Raymond, from what happened to me, let it be this. Do right by people, but don't mistake being good for being a doormat. Kindness without a spine is just an open invitation. Use your head, especially when you're hurting, because the worst decisions get made in the first hot minute. And when the right thing is also the hard thing, find the grit to see it all the way through. Those 3 together, a clear conscience, a clear mind, and a refusal to break, are what let me sit at the head of my own table again, with my grandson across from me, asking for seconds. I almost learned it too late. I'm hoping you won't have to.